It is May 1945. The North Sea is cold, grey and silent in a way it has never been before. For 6 years, these waters roared with the sound of German S-boats, Schnellboote, cutting through the darkness at over 40 knots, launching torpedoes, vanishing before dawn. The Royal Navy feared them. The Americans called them E-boats and cursed their name. Allied convoys were rerouted because of them. Entire operations were redesigned around their threat. And then, almost overnight, they were simply there, docked, engines off, crews standing on the wharves with their hands visible, waiting for orders that were no longer coming from Berlin. The guns had fallen silent. The flotillas that had haunted the English Channel and the Baltic for years were now just wood and steel and diesel fuel, bobbing gently in harbours they had raided not long before. But here is what no history book talks about in detail. Here is the question that has been buried beneath the more famous stories of Tiger tanks and U-boats and Messerschmitts. What happened to those S-boats? Where did they go? Were they destroyed, hidden, handed over, repurposed? Or did some of them simply disappear into the fog of post-war chaos, their stories untold for decades? The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to Germany's S-boat flotillas after the guns fell silent? To understand the scale of what we are talking about, you have to understand what the S-boat actually was. This was not a simple patrol craft. The Schnellboot, fast boat in German, was a purpose-built weapon of terror. Constructed primarily from lightweight mahogany and powered by 3 Daimler-Benz MB511 or MB518 diesel engines, each boat could reach speeds of up to 43.5 knots, making it one of the fastest combat vessels afloat during the entire war. It carried 2 torpedoes, deck guns and mines, and it operated almost exclusively at night, using the darkness as its greatest weapon. By the end of the war, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had produced approximately 249 S-boats across various classes. They were organized into flotillas, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, operating from bases stretching from the French coast at Cherbourg and Boulogne to the Baltic ports of Kiel and Swinemünde. At their peak operational strength, over 34 flotillas existed in various forms, though the number of active combat boats fluctuated constantly due to losses, repair cycles, and the chaos of the final years of the war. These were not forgotten machines. They had sunk over 100 Allied vessels. They had participated in attacks that sent hundreds of Allied sailors to the bottom of the sea. On the night of April the 27th and 28th, 1944, a group of German S-boats stumbled upon the American Exercise Tiger rehearsal for the D-Day landings in Lyme Bay, England, and killed 749 American servicemen, more than died on Utah Beach itself on D-Day. That attack was classified by the Allies for years, so when the war ended, there was no shortage of interest in what these boats were, how they worked, and what should be done with what remained of them. In the final weeks of April and the first days of May 1945, the German S-boat flotillas found themselves in a position no warrior vessel is designed for: absolute stillness. Many of the boats still operational were concentrated in the Baltic, particularly around the Danish island of Bornholm, the port of Kiel, and the Courland Peninsula in Latvia. The commanders of these flotillas knew the war was finished before the formal surrender was signed. Some had already begun making quiet, desperate decisions. The 2nd S-boat flotilla, one of the most decorated and feared units, was operating out of the Baltic in the final days. With Soviet forces closing in from the east and the formal German surrender imminent, the flotilla commanders faced a choice that had no good answer: fight on and die, surrender to the Soviets, or make for the British or American lines. which felt at least like the lesser of the catastrophes available to them. Many crews chose the latter. There was a mass movement of German naval vessels westward in the final days, an event sometimes called the largest naval evacuation in history, though it is far less famous than Dunkirk. S-boats participated in Operation Hannibal, the evacuation of German troops and civilians from the eastern Baltic, carrying soldiers and refugees across ice-cold waters under constant Soviet air attack. When that was done, when there was nothing left to do, the crews brought their boats to ports under British or American control and waited. The British received the largest share of surrendered S-boats. Vessels came into ports at Kiel, Flensburg, and across the Danish coast. Picture this moment. Royal Navy officers stepping aboard these sleek, mahogany-hulled machines that had haunted their convoys for years, running their hands along the deck, fittings, inspecting the torpedo tubes, reading the logbook still lying open on the chart tables. There was no celebration in these moments. There was something stranger, a cold, professional curiosity. The Americans received some boats as well, primarily in the North Sea theatre. The Soviets, true to the agreement reached at Potsdam, received their share too, a fact that would have enormous consequences that almost no one today connects to the S-boat story. In the immediate aftermath, there was looting, though that is perhaps too crude a word for what happened. Every Allied naval power wanted to know how these boats worked. British intelligence teams moved quickly through the surrendered flotillas, removing technical manuals, engine specifications, torpedo guidance documents, and communication logs before the ink was dry on the surrender paperwork. American naval engineers did the same where their access allowed. This was not mere curiosity. This was the beginning of the Cold War, and speed, the kind of speed the S-boat represented, was suddenly very relevant again. The destruction came quickly, and it came on a massive scale. The Allied Control Commission, the joint body that administered conquered Germany, had very clear rules about German military hardware. It was to be demilitarized, destroyed, or distributed among the victors. For the S-boats, this meant that the vast majority of the surviving fleet, roughly 130 to 150 boats still considered operational or repairable at the time of surrender, were marked for disposal within months of the war ending. Imagine walking through the naval yards at Kiel in the autumn of 1945. Rows of S-boats are moored along the quays, their mahogany hulls beginning to show the first signs of neglect. Paint peeling where it had once been pristine. Lines gone slack, engines cold and silent. Dockyard workers, many of them former Kriegsmarine personnel now employed by the occupying authorities, moved among the boats with cutting torches and salvaged tools. The boats were stripped of their weapons first, torpedo tubes removed, deck guns cut free, depth charge racks dismantled. Then the engines, worth enormous sums for their precision engineering, were pulled out for separate evaluation or sale. What was left was often simply burned or broken up for scrap. The British scrapping program was thorough. By 1946, the Royal Navy had determined that the cost of maintaining the captured S-boats was not justified by their usefulness. Britain already had its own motor torpedo boat program, and while the S-boat was impressive, it was built around German engines, German spare parts, and German technical knowledge, all of which were now expensive and difficult to source. One by one, boats were towed to breakers' yards and reduced to raw material. In the American zone, the process was similar, but faster. The US Navy evaluated several boats for technical intelligence purposes. Test runs were conducted in sheltered waters along the Danish and German coasts, with American engineers measuring speed, handling, fuel consumption, and structural performance. And then those boats too were turned over for destruction once their secrets had been documented. The numbers are sobering. Of the approximately 249 S-boats produced during the war, The Royal Navy alone received 34 vessels for evaluation and eventual disposal. The Soviets received their allocated share under the Potsdam distribution agreements. The remainder were either scuttled by their crews in the final chaotic days, destroyed in Allied bombing raids on German ports during the war's final weeks, or broken up in the scrapping programs of 1945 and 1946. By the time 1947 arrived, the great S-boat flotillas had been almost entirely reduced to silence. Almost. The Soviet chapter of this story is the one that history tends to skip over, and it is perhaps the most consequential. Under the agreements reached between the Allied powers regarding the division of captured German military hardware, the Soviet Union received a portion of the surviving German surface fleet, including a number of S-boats. These were not simply put on display or broken up for scrap. The Soviets had a specific, urgent use for them. Soviet naval doctrine in the immediate post-war years placed enormous emphasis on fast attack craft, small, fast, heavily armed boats capable of operating in the shallow coastal waters of the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Arctic. The Soviets had already been building their own torpedo boats during the war, but the German S-boats were, by any honest assessment, superior machines. They were faster, more seaworthy in rough conditions, and their diesel engines gave them a much longer range than contemporary Soviet designs. Soviet engineers did not simply use the captured S-boats as they found them. They studied them with the same intensity that Soviet engineers applied to captured German jet engines and rocket technology. The hull forms, the engine arrangements, the torpedo tube configurations, all of these were analyzed, documented, and in several specific design features, incorporated into subsequent Soviet fast attack craft development programs. The Project 183 torpedo boat, which the Soviets produced in enormous numbers through the 1950s and exported to client states around the world, including China, Cuba, Egypt, and North Korea, shows clear design lineage that traces in part back to what Soviet engineers learned from the captured S-boats. This means, in a remarkable historical irony, that design principles first refined by German naval architects for the Kriegsmarine ended up in the torpedo boats used by North Korea during the Korean War and by Egypt against Israel during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and by Cuba in the waters around the island that nearly brought the world to nuclear war in 1962. The S-boat's ghost moved through the Cold War in ways its designers never imagined, and that the Western public has almost never been told. There are 3 stories from this period that deserve specific attention, because they capture the strangeness and the human texture of what happened to these boats. The first involves S-130, one of the most significant surviving S-boats in the world today, though its survival was entirely accidental in the beginning. S-130 was part of the 5th S-boat flotilla, operating in the English Channel during 1944. This specific boat was present near the area of operations during the Exercise Tiger attack on the night of April the 27th to 28th, 1944. The night 749 American soldiers died in Lime Bay. After the German surrender, S-130 was transferred to British custody. It was used briefly for evaluation purposes, and then, in a decision that was almost purely bureaucratic, it was transferred to a British Naval Auxiliary role, rather than immediately scrapped. It spent years in various states of use and neglect, changing hands several times, before eventually passing into private ownership. The boat deteriorated significantly over decades. By the time serious preservation efforts began, it was in a state of near complete structural failure. It has since undergone one of the most significant small warship restorations ever attempted in the United Kingdom, and it survives today as the only fully restored original German Second World War S-boat in existence. The restoration project, based in Ramsgate, England, the very coastline these boats once threatened, is ongoing, and represents a direct physical connection to those events in Lyme Bay. The second story involves the boats that went to Norway. Norway received several former German S-boats as part of post-war naval reconstruction assistance. This was not generosity on anyone's part, it was practicality. Norway needed a coastal defense force quickly. Soviet intentions in Scandinavia were unclear, and there were perfectly functional German fast attack boats available at minimal cost. The Norwegian Navy operated former German S-boats under Norwegian colours into the early 1950s, giving them new names and painting out all evidence of their origins. Norwegian sailors trained on machines that had, in some cases, operated against Allied convoys just a few years before. The boats eventually wore out and were replaced by purpose-built Norwegian and American-designed vessels. But for nearly a decade, the Kriegsmarine's fast attack capability continued to patrol North Sea and North Atlantic waters, just under a different flag. The third story is the strangest of all, and it connects the S-boat directly to the very first days of the Cold War in a way that almost no one discusses. In the chaos of May 1945, as the German surrender was being processed across multiple fronts and multiple naval theatres simultaneously, a small number of S-boats simply vanished from the official record. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an administrative reality. The surrender and distribution process was chaotic, documentation was incomplete, and some boats that appear in German naval records as surviving to the war's end do not appear in any Allied disposal or distribution records. Whether these boats were scuttled quietly by crews who did not want them falling into specific hands, whether they were hidden in remote inlets and later found by local fishermen, or whether they were claimed by individuals or organizations operating outside official channels is not fully known. What is known is that the official accounting of surrendered S-boats has gaps. Gaps that historians have noted but been unable to fully close. There is a specific category of unknown that clings to the S-boat story and refuses to let go. The Exercise Tiger connection has never been fully resolved in the public record. The attack of April 27th to 28th, 1944, which killed 749 American servicemen in Lyme Bay during a rehearsal for the D-Day landings, was classified by Allied command and not made public for decades. The men who died were listed initially as casualties of the D-Day landings themselves, their deaths absorbed into the enormous totality of that operation. Their families were not fully informed of the circumstances for years. When the story finally became public in the 1980s, largely through the efforts of a Devon man named Ken Small, who recovered an American Sherman tank from the seafloor of Lyme Bay, it emerged that the S-boats responsible for the attack had never been specifically named or held to any form of post-war accounting. The crews of those boats, whoever they were, from whichever flotilla, went on to surrender in the Baltic or the North Sea and were processed through the standard prisoner of war and demobilization systems. They were never specifically identified. The specific boats involved were never conclusively established in the open record. The men of Exercise Tiger went to the bottom, and the men who sent them there came home to post-war Germany and rebuilt their lives, their identities folded into the larger anonymity of defeat. There is also the question of technology transfer that went in a direction no one expected. Several German S-boat engineers and designers were recruited under programs similar in structure, though far less famous, to Operation Paperclip, the American program that brought German rocket scientists to the United States. British naval design teams consulted with former Lürssen engineers, Lürssen being the primary shipyard that built the S-boats, in the late 1940s and early 1950s as Britain developed its post-war fast patrol boat doctrine. Some of the design vocabulary that appears in British fast patrol boats of the 1950s and 1960s reflects, at least in part, conversations that took place between Allied naval architects and the men who had spent the war trying to sink Allied ships. The third of these hidden stories involves the wrecks. Somewhere in the waters of the English Channel, the North Sea, the Baltic, and off the coast of Norway, there are S-boat wrecks on the sea floor. Boats that were sunk by Allied action, by mines, by accident, or by deliberate scuttling in the war's final hours. Some of these have been located by sport divers and maritime archaeologists. Others have not. The Baltic in particular, which is cold and relatively low in salinity, is a remarkable preservative environment for wooden-hulled vessels. It is entirely possible, naval historians have said as much, that there are S-boats on the floor of the Baltic in a state of preservation that would make them extraordinary archaeological discoveries. None have been officially identified and documented as such to date. Today, the physical legacy of the S-boat flotillas exists in fragments, scattered across museums, private collections, restoration projects, and the sea floor. The most significant survivor is the S-130 at Ramsgate, already mentioned, a boat whose survival was part accident, part stubbornness, and part the decades-long dedication of people who understood that this machine represented something that should not be entirely erased. The restoration project has been painstaking, with original material sourced wherever possible, and the work done to standards that would allow the boat to eventually be made seaworthy again. Ramsgate is no accident as a location. It was from ports along this coastline that the Allied response to the S-boat threat was organized, and it is a specific, deliberate historical resonance that the last survivor rests here. The German Naval Museum in Wilhelmshaven holds documentation, artifacts, and technical materials related to the S-boat program. The Deutsches Meeresmuseum and various other German maritime institutions hold models, equipment fragments, and archival materials. But there is no complete, intact S-boat on display in Germany, a fact that reflects the totality of the Allied scrapping program and the deliberate dismantling of visible German military heritage in the post-war years. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, maritime museums hold various artifacts from the S-boat era: engine components, torpedo fittings, navigation instruments recovered from wrecks or preserved from the boats that served under Scandinavian flags in the late 1940s. These are fragments, not survivors. The Lürssen shipyard, which built the vast majority of Germany's S-boats, still exists. It is now one of the most respected yacht and naval vessel builders in the world, producing luxury motor yachts for billionaires and patrol vessels for the German Federal Navy, the Bundesmarine, and its successor, the Deutsche Marine. The engineering heritage of the S-boat, the pursuit of speed, range, and seakeeping in a compact and powerful hull, runs through the company's DNA in a way that is acknowledged internally, but rarely discussed publicly. The firm that built the weapons of the Kriegsmarine now builds the patrol boats of democratic Germany. That transition, quiet and unremarked, is perhaps the most complete statement of what happened to the S-boat legacy. There is something in the story of the S-boats after 1945 that resists easy resolution, and that resistance is, in its own way, the most honest thing about it. These were machines built to kill efficiently and vanish before they could be caught. They operated in darkness, in the space between certainty and mystery. And after the war, they continued to do, essentially, the same thing, slipping into the post-war world through back channels and bureaucratic gaps, showing up under foreign flags, leaving design traces in the torpedo boats of countries whose names would not have meant anything to the engineers in Bremen who bent the first frames in 1930. The S-boat flotillas did not end in 1945. They dissolved into the Soviet Navy, into the Norwegian Coastal Defense Force, into the analytical reports of British and American naval intelligence, into the cold water of the Baltic, into the restoration workshop of a small harbour town on the English coast, where the last survivor is being slowly, carefully put back together. There is a particular quality to objects that have survived great violence and the attempt to erase them. They carry something that is difficult to name, not quite guilt, not quite pride, not quite mourning. The men who built the S-boats believed they were engineering a kind of supremacy. The men who sailed them believed they were serving something larger than themselves. The men who captured and scrapped and studied them believed they were closing a chapter of history. But history does not close cleanly. It seeps through the cracks. It turns up in the design files of shipyards in Leningrad. It rests on the seafloor of the Baltic, in water cold enough to preserve wood across generations. What really happened to Germany's S-boat flotillas after the war? They were destroyed, and they survived. They were erased, and they propagated. They were forgotten, and they shaped the world that followed. And in a small harbour in southeast England, the last one still floats, quietly, patiently, waiting to tell anyone willing to listen exactly what it remembers.